Hello to all who have joined us for our monthly webinar series. Today we'll be looking at how to turn performance feedback into positive employee engagement. And we'll be hearing from our Senior VP of Consulting, Norm Bailey-David, as he explores this area. My name is Monica Helgoff. I'm the VP of Western Business at TalentMap, and I will be hosting today's session. Just before we get started, we'll take a look at the agenda, and then I want to cover off just a few housekeeping items with you. So we're going to spend about 5 minutes today exploring why this topic is important, and then we'll take a look at the correlation between performance feedback and employee engagement. We'll spend another 10 minutes or so looking at the trend in performance appraisals with some case studies, and then we'll talk about lessons learned. We'll reserve about 5 minutes or so for your questions and answers. You'll see at the right-hand side of the screen that there's an opportunity for you to enter in your questions. Please feel free to do that at any time throughout the presentation, but we'll be taking those questions at the end of the session. I just also want to point out that the presentation will be available in about a week's time on our website, so you'll be able to access the on-demand presentation and listen to it as you please. Just to get started, a little bit about TalentMap. We've been in business for well over 15 years now, and our sole focus is on workplace measurement, workplace surveys. We've done thousands of surveys since inception, and literally we've worked in every type of sector imaginable, from organizations with 50 employees all the way up to 100,000 plus. Our work is predominantly in the North American space, but we also have done work globally as well. We'll just take a look at the next slide, which will give you a view of some of the many different clients that we work with. So you'll see we work with a lot of knowledge-based type of organizations such as technology and engineering, not-for-profits, public sector, healthcare, financial services, and other industry organizations. All right, well, thank you very much, and let's turn the mic over to Norm and learn more about this topic.
Good morning, good afternoon, wherever in this continent you might happen to be, whichever time zone that is. Hello everybody, my name is Norm Bailey-David, and I'm going to take you through the topic for today, which is really around the importance and the evolution of performance feedback and performance appraisals, and really taking a look at it from the engagement slant. And I'd like to start off these talks really by sort of introducing why we're putting this forward at this particular time. And the reason we're doing it is because we're seeing, not only with our clients, but in industry generally, there's a rapid evolution taking place with how feedback is given. Now, performance feedback historically, at least historically when we're talking about employee engagement, so that's 15, 20 years, has never been one of those sort of top-of-mind topics. We've usually, the key drivers of engagement have tended to revolve around career, professional growth, around the culture of innovation, around organizational vision, and performance feedback has really sort of been left off the table. Even when it's been an irritant in some organizations, a lot of employees have tended to put it aside in terms of, and compartmentalize, and it didn't have a big impact on how engaged people felt at the organization. Well, what we've been seeing in the last, I would say, 2 years or so, is that's changing, and that's changing very, very rapidly as feedback becomes much more important and an important driver of engagement. So what I want to talk to you really about today is, first of all, show you some of our own client examples of where feedback is positioning on the engagement scale, and what some of the feedback practices that are good clients, in terms of good engaged clients, are doing really well, and what are the ones that are struggling, what are they doing differently. So that will set us up for a couple of case studies. And the case studies I'm going to bring to bear today are some multinational organizations that have had these epiphanies within the last 2 years or so in terms of how to deliver performance feedback and appraisals. And I think it's very, very telling, and then you'll see that all the dots will connect at the end in terms of really what the pressures have been, what the solutions are going to be, and hopefully that should point us in a very, very clear direction in terms of where we should go with performance feedback. So where does performance feedback fall in terms of overall engagement? And as I was saying before, if you look at the slide in front of you, if you can see my cursor here, historically we've seen it sort of, it hasn't been one of those things that have been really well executed amongst most clients. So when we look at the average client, we'll see it sort of in the average, sort of represented by that horizontal line. But on the left-hand side of this quadrant, and the left-hand side means a relatively weak driver of engagement. But we're seeing that starting to change now. So I'm going to show you a few examples of that. So this example here, first of all, let me show you what you're looking at, or explain what you're looking at. So what you're looking at here is what we do for every Talent Map client. We establish one of these, we call them quad maps. And what they show, what they represent are 12 or 13 employee engagement dimensions or themes related to two dimensions. So one being the benchmark average, which is represented by this horizontal line at the bottom, and the other being the relationship that each dimension has to how engaged or disengaged employees tend to be. So the further to the right on this chart, the stronger that influence of that dimension is on employee engagement, and of course the more impact it's going to have if we improve that dimension, if we're going to improve engagement. This particular client is one of the highest client in terms of employee engagement in our benchmark. So their overall engagement is roughly around 90% of their employees fit the definition of engagement. So a very, very highly engaged organization. And lo and behold, it was very, very surprising to us to see that the single most important driver for this client that performs so well in terms of engagement is how it delivers feedback to its employees. What this means is a couple of things. The first thing is it means, relatively speaking, it's performing much better than the average organization in terms of how it delivers its feedback. So that's well above that benchmark line. But more importantly, it's because of that performance that it's having a very, very strong impact in terms of engagement. And of course, other dimensions that are having important impact on engagement for this particular client are teamwork, innovation, client focus, but performance feedback. And we never used to see this before. Performance feedback is the single most important driver of engagement. So that's one thing that's come to bear. So now we see something a little bit more typical, where, of course, the typical client now is going to have more of these themes huddled around that horizontal bar, the average, and you can see performance feedback is also sort of right above average. It's not really standing out very much. It's sort of caught in the middle here. Some things are more important to engagement, like change management, professional growth, so more of the traditional things. But performance feedback is still on the right-hand side of this, and they're doing relatively well. Not so great, not so average, but it's sort of, it's one of those dimensions that's really sort of caught in the mass. And what happens as a result is, even we're guilty of coaching organizations to focus on those things that are more important. So in this particular example, we would have coached our client here to pay particular attention to change management, professional growth, and perhaps something like innovation, which is not doing as well, and performance feedback would have gotten forgotten. But in this particular case, we're also starting to see, when we peel back the onion, we're starting to see some of the causes of, of this increased importance in terms of performance feedback. And some of them are actually quite cut and dry, very, very straightforward, surprisingly so. So in this for this particular client, you read that first quote: the performance appraisal process can be improved by bringing back the 5-tiered measurement, and it goes on. And what we're seeing very, very often here, and then is the rating scales used are considered very subjective, are considered very arbitrary. But when we're sitting in the HR chair, this is pretty much the only tool we've had up to now is to use these rating scales and to use supervisor ratings in terms of establishing performance appraisals. And what we're seeing with, with this evolution is these appraisal processes are starting to have a detrimental impact on engagement, because one of the reasons being these rating components. The other thing is, the last quote illustrates that here. The performance evaluation feedback done at the very last minute, right at the deadline, process has little value. Continuous, less formal feedback would be much better. There is there is definitely a push that we're seeing from our clients' employees that are saying, we need more feedback more often. The annual process just isn't doing it for us. And what we see here, when we go back to our highest employee engaged client, where feedback was right here way up in this positive quadrant, this top right-hand quadrant, is this particular client was providing feedback on a much more frequent basis. So now the typical client, the average engagement client, it looks something like this. It's performance feedback not done very well relative to benchmark. Other things much more important. So feedback, again, similar to this one here, lost in the shuffle, but in actual fact, most clients, and I would perceive, or I would think that, if the folks that I'm talking to today, if you folks are following the same distribution of our average client base, which is very, very robust, thousands of organizations, then your curve is most likely to look like this, where we focus, the things that are driving our engagement are growth and leadership and innovation and vision, and something like performance feedback, we might not be doing too well on it from our employees' perspective, but it's also not one of those key engagement drivers either, at least not enough to, historically, to focus on as a priority. So what tends to happen, this clip is from the same client surveys as this particular chart here. So you see in this particular instance where you've got a client where fewer than half are positive or favorable towards their overall performance feedback mechanism, and you can see significant minorities, more than a third in some cases, are saying that the evaluation process helps them to be more productive. They're actually disagreeing with that statement. So we have a situation with, at least in most of Talent Map's clients, we have a situation where performance feedback is not well liked from the majority of employees, but nothing much has been done to change it until now. And now I'm hoping this webinar will be the catalyst to realize that this is going on, and that if we can improve this, we will achieve the results that our example client up the top of the presentation has achieved. So, and we can start to erase this unfavorable, this level of disagreement with these statements, and translate that performance feedback into higher engagement, so higher ratings on feedback, and then of course higher ratings on engagement as a result. We also look at employees' comments. When we see situations such as this one here, where feedback is not well perceived, when it is more important as a driver, we tend to look at a lot of the employee comments, and we use some text analytics to do that. And typically, what you see in terms of this bubble chart in front of you is you see that there's two real issues that come up again and again and again in terms of our employee surveys, in terms of as to why performance feedback is not perceived very well. The first reason, and essentially these bubbles here, or these blocks, go by the frequency of the concept that's being discussed, is the objectives keep changing. So over the typical annual or even semi-annual evaluation process, where most organizations do it annually still, within that year, objectives and what we expect from our employees are shifting and changing and evolving. Yet the annual the annual performance feedback or appraisal process only does this once a year, so it doesn't keep up with those changing objectives. And of course, people want more frequent feedback. If you run an annual performance feedback process or performance evaluation or appraisal process, you know how much anticipation there is on the sort of trepidation on the manager side who have to give these, anticipation on the employee side because they're thirsty for feedback. And not only that, of course, there's the compensation element of this, sort of the elephant in the room, if you will. That's really, you know, everybody's sort of sitting on edge for that employee evaluation that comes once a year that's going to determine their compensation and, you know, finally get some feedback in terms of promotion. How are we doing? What does it mean for my comp type of process? Increasingly, you know, folks are saying, no, we want to hear more about this. So this is sort of setting the stage, you know, and when we do that content or the comment analysis, you know, we can also track sentiments in terms of positive or negative, and you look at some of the stuff that's coming up around evaluation, and we're seeing that the processes themselves becoming just a formality. Periodic one-on-one chats with my manager are more constructive. Also, often the goals that are set are so far ahead in time, when it comes time to compare accomplishments against the goals, it just looks bad because the goals weren't met, but it's not like we sat around twiddling our thumbs. We're working on other stuff. Essentially articulating very, very well around the objectives that keep changing and the desire for more frequent feedback. So we're left with this gap. We understand now what's causing the gap. What do we start to do about it? So, you know, in terms of what's working and what's not working, so what are some of the things, sort of just to summarize here, that disengage, that discourage, that come up increasingly in the comments that we see and the trends that we see? The annual review, first of all. More and more we're seeing the comments that I've just shown you, this in terms of few or no conversations taking place in between. You know, some of the better managers do have those conversations, and I'm not, you know, painting with a broad brush here. There, you know, I'm not saying nobody does it, but when there's an annual evaluation process, it gives many managers an out in terms of not having to have those conversations if they don't feel comfortable with them, and so then the annual cycle continues, and that annual cycle is very discouraging and disengaging to many staff. The second thing I haven't mentioned up to now is the ranking and the percentile method. So in many organizations, what happens is not only is there an annual review, an individual review, but those reviews are stacked up against colleagues and peers. And then we use, well, the top 10% based on our ratings get X% compensation, and then the top half get Y%, and the bottom half get canceled out. I mean, this is a real actual example of some evaluation ratings. Of course, any time that we pit employees against each other in this way, whether or not it's behind closed doors, it creates competition instead of collaboration. It pits employee against employee. It causes a whole lot of bad feelings because of the lack of transparency, and essentially it contributes to disengagement. And of course, with that comes with these rating scales. Now, as I'm going to talk to you in one of the case examples, research has been done, extensive research has been done, that really show that rating scales reflect much more the evaluator, the supervisor, and represents much more of what they mean than it does the employee. So I'll talk about that a little bit more. Typically, the annual review conversation, or even if it's much more than annual, if it's semi-annual, if it's quarterly, conversations still focus on past performance as opposed to future development, and I'll talk about that in our case studies. And then finally, there's, you know, we've had this emphasis on strengths and weaknesses, which really represent, as soon as we see strengths and weaknesses, we've all been in those conversations, at least those of us who've been around a while, in terms of, well, everybody has to have a weakness type of logic. And all that does is serve to demotivate, disengage, and discourage. Yes, we all have areas that we need to improve. It's a question of nuance and a question of how we communicate and nuance those conversations. So What are we seeing in our research that engages and motivates? Well, we're seeing very frequent feedback. Frequent feedback on even a weekly basis, on a monthly basis at least, but much more than the semi-annual or annual basis. And not only frequent, but informal. It's not about filling in the evaluation, sitting the employee down in an office in a very intimidating way, boss to employee, and providing those strengths and weaknesses and areas to improve for the next time around, and then associating that with a compensation increase. Those conversations are exactly what discourages. Informal conversations, informal recognition, pats on the back, and just avoiding all the subjectivity inherent in those rating scales and focusing the conversation on the future, less on the past. Those are the things that are engaging and motivating, and those are what we see that really explain, I'll go right back to the top here, that really we saw with this particular client and the reasons why they do performance feedback so well and how well it's tied to engagement. So at this point, we're probably thinking, and you're probably thinking, well, all well and good, but how do we actually do this? What are companies actually doing to transition from what we know, which is the annual engagement or the annual appraisal process? I keep using the word engagement. I mean appraisal or evaluation process. And how do we then move to these more informal, frequent conversations and still keep an element of evaluation that we can tie compensation to? Therein lies the challenge. A couple of other things. I just came across some survey results only this morning. So I built this in at the very, very last minute, a survey done by Quantum Workplace. And this survey was about 300 organizations, and there's a couple of slides that I really want to show you. And it basically does two things. The first one you'll see here is the annual performance review usage by engagement level. So what's happening is the percentage here drops. The highly engaged organizations are no longer using the annual performance review. So if I interpret this for you, 78% or 70, of the disengaged organizations, more than 3/4 are still doing annual performance evaluation. Somewhat disengaged, 75 or 74% are still, 3/4 of them are using the annual review. When you get to the highly engaged, only about half of those are still using the annual performance review. You can see a clear relationship, inverse relationship, between the organizations using that annual review and level of engagement. There is the tie, right there. So obviously you deduce from this that the annual engagement, the annual appraisal is no longer working. It's actually it's counterproductive. It's leading to more disengagement. So what does work? Well, the #1 communication strategy amongst the highest engaged organizations from this same survey is the one-on-one conversation, and of course much more frequently. So all this tying together to sort of begin to paint the picture as to what the issues are, where the trends are leading. So obviously when we get into the case studies, it's going to be, I think, I'm sort of giving the story away in terms of what's happening. So let me get into a couple of those now. The first one is a unit of General Electric. And now the articles that are based on these, I'll source them in this document. You'll be able to look them up. And I'm not inventing this by any stretch of the imagination. I just, we're doing the research to see what works best, and we're coming up with these case studies. But this is actually what's working. So when we looked at the GE case, and when you look at the GE case, I mean, what the situation was before they started to revamp their evaluation or appraisal process is you had within this, it's not GE writ large, it was the turbines unit, about 800 or so employees. And like many organizations that we survey as well, they're focused on, the teams and the departments are all focused on their own objectives. They're all resulting in their entrenched silos. And why that was because each of the departments or divisions were provided with milestones, objectives, and performance metrics for that division. So what do you think happens? Basically, all of the efforts, all of the all of the activity and energy is focused on achieving the department objective and the department metric as opposed to the overall division or organization metric. And of course, that's going to drive silos. And so they realized it. And then you also had annual objectives changing very rapidly, client demands changing very rapidly. And those annual objectives just couldn't keep pace with those changing demands. So remember this chart? It's it's not from GE. It's one of ours that you saw before, but it's exactly painting the same picture that this organization in GE saw. So what was their solution? Well, the first thing that they introduced was something called touch points. Now, touch points were established between managers and the direct report, where they would hold a regular, they call them touch points. And that what they would do is they would set or update priorities based on customer needs. Now, these touch points could happen at the frequency desired between manager and employee, as long as it was done at least once per month. So it could have been done more often, but at least once per month, managers and employees would have these touch points. Now, the way they got around, the way they dispensed with the annual review process and folded that in so they can use these conversations for compensation purposes, where they documented these conversations. And of course, being a technical unit of GE, they had IT people develop a specialized app for them. Now, not everybody's going to go out and develop an app to do this, but the key here is when they developed very easy ways to record or to document the conversation and minimize the paperwork. Because what they'll find, and what you will find, as soon as you insist on your managers in your organizations doing this more frequently, is you'll get pushback because they're going to see it as more paperwork, more administration. I've got to fill out more forms, it's going to take more time, yada, yada, yada. Well, you can basically put a phone down on the desk and record it, file that away, and that's done. So there's no additional effort. And then, of course, the employee can call up on those conversations that have happened over the year and use that as documentation to support their assertions in the overall or the annual compensation review process, not the same as performance appraisal. So, and the second thing about these, so you had the frequency of conversations, but what was really important here in this particular case was the twist in terms of the conversation. So now development was much more forward-looking and ongoing. So managers were not looking at past performance and saying, okay, this is what your strengths are, this is what your weaknesses are, this is what you need to improve. They were coming from, they were saying, this is what we want you to work on in the future. Now, it's essentially the same thing from our perspective, but from the employee's perspective, it's much more motivating. And, of course, the manager could call in and did call in suggestions from anybody in the employee's network. Some of them did it formally, others did it informally, some of them used 360, others just did it through informal conversations, but they documented those through the touch point mechanism that I talked about before. So what do those conversations look like? I mean, it sounds good in theory. How do you actually change a conversation between manager and employee? Well, here we're looking at, some of the conversations look like, first of all, they dispensed with the sticky label strengths and weaknesses. They're learning a new vocabulary. And you would say, focusing always on behaviors. Now, in HR and in psychology, we already know this. We focus on behaviors, not character traits. We don't personalize it. It's not who you are, it's what you do. However, now you introduce the forward-looking aspect to the conversation. So this comment, basically here, the quote illustrates it very well. We focus instead on behaviors employees may want to continue, as well as changes they might want to consider making. The new vocabulary focuses teams less on the backward-looking feedback, more on the forward-looking action. So, Mr. Employee or Ms. Employee, you might want to continue doing this. You might want to consider doing more of that. Now, what that does is it leaves the behavior change to the discretion of the individual. It allows them to absorb. It's much less directive. Yet what the experience, the GE experience shows is that the large majority of folks that are coached this way with these touch points, and because they're happening on a frequent basis, And you know, if somebody doesn't change over time, the frequency of that, well, you really might want to consider doing X, comes up again and again. Eventually, the person, if they don't already want to do that, they try it on their own volition, of their own accord. And of course, discretionary effort and working on one's volition, own volition, is the definition of being engaged. So you see this becomes much more naturally, and then that encourages the behavior change. As we're going to talk about in the next case, we often know that the existing performance appraisal system very rarely leads to true behavior change. It really reinforces existing behaviors. So anyway, I'll get to that in a minute. So, and what GE found was this sort of shift from the command and control, strengths, weaknesses, annual appraisal process to this empower and inspire approach, increased their productivity by fivefold. So, that really, obviously, you can see how those translate into the benefits of employees and customers. Of course, what they're mentioning here, but we understand in engagement reading between the lines, is that fivefold increase in productivity comes because the engagement of the employee is increasing. That's the middle ground. And performance feedback in that process is a large degree of what's driving that. So the other aspect of this particular case, I really like it because it isolates a word that I've been coaching leaders with more and more. And I think if there's a buzzword that's going to be there in terms of leadership development in the next 5 years, it's this buzzword. It's this word, sorry, I didn't mean to do the highlighter, I meant to do this, is vulnerable. As leaders show vulnerability to their teams, to their employees, to their cohorts, so do they express their humanness, and that humanness, that vulnerability, is also going to breed empathy from the employee side, contributing to that behavior change. So that's the GE case. Let me get to the next case around Deloitte. Now, Deloitte's an organization that talents, we partner with Deloitte on a frequent basis at TalentMap. And this particular case comes from the article that's written here in the source. And I can tell you firsthand, having worked in a competitor of Deloitte, where this is emanating, because basically the big 5 consulting firms operate in a very, very similar manner. So not only do we work with and collaborate with Deloitte through TalentMap, I also have experience in this business from a competitor of Deloitte. So, getting back to the situation, what's driving change? What did Deloitte see that sort of pushed them to the brink of having to change their process? The first thing is they did their own survey of executives, and lo and behold, more than half don't believe that the current performance appraisal approach was either driving engagement nor performance. So when you got more than half of senior executives, almost 6 in 10 senior executives not believing that their current processes are working, well, that's obviously going to stimulate the impetus for change. This is the second one I mentioned before already, is the existing approach to performance appraisal. That annual strengths, weaknesses, rating scale approach is actually having very little impact on future performance. Now think about it for a second. Your stars, your hypos, your star performers are star performers year in, year out. Your performance challenges, the folks that are on the bottom of the curve, well, they tend to be there year in, year out, don't they? You don't see, as a result of an appraisal, you don't tend to see a lot of movement from that position in terms of the overall distribution. The performance, one's performance is not changing as a result of the performance appraisal process. And as you saw in a previous slide, employees themselves don't feel the process is contributing to their own productivity. So if that's the case, nothing's changing as a result. So of course, if nothing changes, then we're not improving productivity and we're not improving process. The other thing, the next thing is there's a huge time investment in the process itself. And of course, as I alluded to before, you already get feedback or pushback from your managers who are putting this in terms of the time it takes. If it's a performance appraisal time, there's that, I can hear the groan in the office Every time it's performance appraisal month, and you get that grown. Why? Because there's so much time invested in this process. For Deloitte, it was more than 2 million man-hours a year, 65,000 employees. That works out, do the straight division, 30 hours per person per year. I can tell you from experience that that's not far off the mark. When you've got around, about 4 or 5 reports, you're going to spend almost a day in terms of preparation, in terms of rating, in terms of the conversation. But ironically enough, most of that time is not spent with the employees. It's spent in conversation with peers and superiors about rating the employees. So very little of those 30 hours are actually used to coach the employee. And if you think about it in terms of the time spent, lots of time talking about preparing the appraisal process, talking to peers and rating and comparing employees with each other, coming down to a funnel where you have that 1 hour conversation. And you know what? 1 hour is generous. Most of these conversations are 15, 20 minutes, half an hour, if that, with the actual employee. So when you spend 30 hours per person per year, and you're only spending one of those 30 with the employee, surely you're not going to get the true impact in terms of a coaching discussion. And then finally, I alluded to this one as well. There's a very, very good study done in the Journal of Applied Psychology, a very, very little known study that actually demonstrates very clearly that our trusted, tried and true, used to be, system of performance ratings is actually rating more and says more about the rater, the supervisor, than it does about the performance of the ratee. And so what you have is a case of, if I've got 2 managers, myself and my colleague, and we rate 5 employees each, well, the ratings of those 5 employees are more reflective about me than they are about them. And essentially, if you think about it intuitively, I don't need to go into the science. You can read the article that's sourced there for you to get into that science proof. But think about it. When we were in school, whether it be high school or university, everybody knew the reputation of the teachers that were the hard markers and the teachers that were the easy markers. And it was all about how those teachers, read supervisors, view themselves and what they should do, and they reflect that in terms of the rating of the employee. So the ratings, those subjective ratings are based much more on the rater than the ratee. So we're not, they're not really driving performance per se. So those are the observations, that are driving this process. So what's the solution? Well, you know what? Frequency, again, the weekly check-in is the first thing that was introduced. Now, every team leader in the weekly check-in had to check in with a team member once a week. Now, you can just imagine the hue and cry of the managers if you tell them that you got to check in with each of your team members once a week. Can you imagine that? And of course, this is not in addition to the work of the team leader. This now becomes the work of the team leader. And it's a fundamental recognition that the team leader's work is to manage the team and not to do other work and use the team or sort of that management or evaluation or coaching process as an adjunct. It is the core of the team leader's responsibility. Now, the second piece of this is we all know that many managers, probably the majority, are not comfortable doing that evaluation conversation. It's something that is, giving feedback is not innate. It's counter to what we, it's counter to most people feel comfortable doing. And why? Because we don't like to be confrontational. And we perceive that conversation is going to be confrontational. So we procrastinate as managers. That's the, we have to do it at one point, but we pretend to procrastinate. So if we're talking about a weekly check-in, then the weekly check-in, in order to make that happen, we basically put the onus on the team member to do it because they're much more interested in the feedback. The manager is much less interested in giving it out. So when the check-in is initiated by the team member, it recognizes that simple truth that the team member has more interest in receiving the feedback. So basically, they're coming knocking on your door and say, it's check-in time, I want to hear about how I did. And of course, that's going to initiate the conversation a lot better, a lot easier, and of course, with a lot less necessarily less formality. Now, how the second quandary that we've been alluding to is how do we address that rating bias that I talked about? So Deloitte has recognized that through its own research and through other research. So it's not an easy one because we need ratings to essentially, give us that tie to how we apportion compensation. We need something quantitative to be able to do that. So some organizations are dispensing with ratings altogether. One I heard about this morning. But many organizations just can't bring themselves to dispense with the rating. But what we can do is we can recognize that the rating is more about the rater than the ratee. So we can essentially change how the rating is done as a consequence. So the Deloitte approach, and I really like it for this reason, is because it's more about the rater as opposed to ratee, it focuses the evaluation on what the rater would do as opposed to how they feel about the ratee, which is much more subjective. So if you look at the 4 questions here, it does that. So rather than tell us about, document the strengths and weaknesses of the employee on certain criteria, it's given what I know about this person's performance, and if it were my money, so we're talking the rater's money, supervisor's money, I would award this person the highest possible compensation increase and bonus. So then you can rate that to agree or strong agree. Is what would you do? And that's much more accurate than how do you feel about person X on criteria Y. So then we're seeing, well, what would that person do with them? And it's also more future oriented. Again, given the person's performance, I would always want him or her on my team. Again, this is about the rater, not the ratee, much more accurate now, much less subjective. And then is a person at risk for low performance? Again, that's future performance, not past. And then person is ready for promotion today. So these are just examples of potential and future orientation of the rating scale as opposed to how someone did in the past, based on a rater's bias, natural innate biases that we know exist now. So essentially, we have a situation where we've got, there's fundamental sort of upheaval in terms of feedback and how feedback is meted out, the desire for more feedback. How can we start to change this to our benefit? We've also seen the direct relationship between feedback, appraisal, and productivity and engagement. So, I mean, it really boils down to what can we learn from this research and from this experience? Well, the first thing is if we leave feedback untouched, then we have an opportunity to improve performance feedback, and this is going to improve engagement and performance. So it's very, very clear. Our results show it. Research results show it. Even though it's not as much of a driver, or it hasn't been a driver in the past, it's becoming one of the factors for success in the future. Those organizations with high employee engagement, they get it. We saw it. They get it. They're already doing this, and it's contributing to that higher engagement. They've already intuitively shifted and augmented their approach. And how have they done that? Well, greater frequency, so the touch points and the check-ins, informal conversations, the focus on future development rather than past performance. What would you consider changing this behavior? What, you should keep doing that behavior, always forward-looking, always as opposed to what have you done in the past that can't be changed. And then really, I think, understanding, and this is going to be the tough one, understanding rating scales are more about the rater than they are about the employee. And adjusting our rating scales, if not dispensing with them entirely, at least adjusting them so that they become an evaluation of what the rater, a self-evaluation of what they would do with this employee, as opposed to an evaluation of the employee based on subjective criteria that are saying more about how the rater views themselves than they view the actual employee. So on that note, I'm going to just basically show you a slide here and invite you while we're doing this to ask some questions, to put some questions there. I've got a couple that are already here. I'll address them momentarily. So you can see on the slide where we're going to be. There's another webinar coming up in a month or 3 weeks' time, I guess it would be, in terms of work-life balance. It's one that's near and dear to my heart. The Confessions of the Reformed Workaholic are myself. But really what we're going to be talking about is that the research that's showing the impact of work-life balance on culture of the organization. We're going to be at the conference board conferences, live webinars again in March, in terms of something that's really becoming topical these days is, you know, what do we do about employee engagement in a troubled economy? And I think, you know, the economy is not the same coast to coast to coast. This is going to touch, I think, much more on our Western compatriots than it is going to talk about the East, but, you know, it's going to be relevant for all. And then you can see some of the other conferences that we're attending. So now I'm just going to address the questions that I see here, and hopefully you'll enter a little bit more. So there's one question here: experiences with clients on those that use performance management as a compensation tool and those that do not. Everybody I've been talking about uses some sort of performance rating to evaluate compensation. Most of those, the existing companies, the existing organizations, most of those essentially use some sort of rating scale. What's happening now is in the transition. So in those organizations that are doing very, very well in this area, that are very engaged and very, you know, rated very well in terms of feedback, they're doing a couple of things. They're tying it to compensation, yes, but they're trying to essentially take the bias out of the single supervisor rating scale. So what they're doing is they're expanding the rating scale to encompass more categories. This is a pendulum shift, and so at one point there was only sort of 1, 2, or 3 points in the rating scale. You have an exceeds, meets, or does not meet type of thing, and it was very, very difficult for someone to sort of justify the exceeds. Everybody'd be stuck in the meets, and you'd have about, you know, 4 or 5% that did not meet on any criteria. Now what's happening is these scales are expanding to 4 or 5 or 6, even 6 points, and they're becoming more granular. And feedback is being sought either through a formal 360 or through less formal mechanisms on those same ratings from a variety of peers, so that there's, you know, there's more balance in the approach. So it's not perfect, but these are what some of the better organizations in terms of engagement are doing on this particular subject. So hold on, for some reason the question, there's questions. So I'll keep going here. Can we you'll get a copy of the presentation, as Monica said before. It'll be available down in about a week's time. So unfortunately we can't distribute it right now. There's so many attendees. It would just be a big distraction to the process here. We're almost running out of time. Can you explain again how the rating scale represents more of the rater than the employee? Not sure I get the concept. Okay. So what the study says, what the study did was it looked at several hundred evaluations done by a number of raters and employees. So let's say, I don't know the exact numbers, but let's say you had 20 evaluators evaluating each about 5 employees. And what they did was they looked at essentially the patterns in their ratings. And what they found was the actual rating scales wouldn't vary by the employee's performance. They would vary much more by the rater themselves. So if, in other words, you had some raters that were very, very critical. So the same employee would be rated by this rater's column A as, you know, so let's say it's a 5-point scale. So 5 being excellent, 1 being poor, 3 being average. So you'd have rater A, much more of their ratings would be around the 3 and the 4 mark. Same employee gets rated by rater B, and rater B would rate this employee a 4 or 5. But they would rate all employees or more employees consistently on the 4 to 5 than on the 3 to 4. Why? Well, because rater A in the debrief interviews and analysis was shown that they tend to be very, very critical in terms of performance. They have high self-imposed standards on themselves. They expect that standard to be met by employees, whereas rater B tends to be a lot more encouraging, wants the employee to do well, so they reflect that throughout their rating scale. So you can see the rating itself is saying more about the rater than it is about the employee. And that's essentially what the study shows. And you saw the reference there. You can read the science about it, but it shows indisputably that those rating scales are actually saying more about the rater than they are about the ratee. So next question, once the employee is at the top of their salary grid, you continue to do performance evaluations without any compensation. How do you keep the employee motivated? Oh, that's a good one. And that happens a lot. Essentially, you have to rely on other things. So first of all, assuming that there's a competency framework in place. Now, in some organizations, that's the case. In other organizations, the smaller ones, they don't necessarily have a competency framework. What you try to do with the employee is to coach them in terms of understanding what they're lacking in the competency framework to establish to get to the next grade level, if that's possible. And then sort of to strive for those competencies, to career path with them, to provide them the training that they need, and eventually they'll show the competencies and hopefully can get a promotion. But in many cases, that doesn't happen either. So how do you keep them motivated? Basically, we have to go beyond the performance feedback system. So the first way is through feedback, through constant feedback, we show recognition. So we recognize for a good job. The second way is through job shadowing, cross-functional training. So we expose them to other areas of the business to keep them engaged. However, it's going to happen that all these things, the employee is going to be smart. They're going to say, I can do the job for the next level, but I'm not getting the promotion. So they need to be learning. They need to be growing. At some point in time, they're going to make a decision. If they get the opportunity to leave, they're going to leave for that higher position. What we need to do is keep them engaged in the meantime. And we keep them engaged through that cross-functional training, through that job shadowing, through that recognition. How would you recommend a team to transition to this type of performance management, leaving the dark side of the subjective and the rankism? Well, obviously, this isn't done in a vacuum. So what I would suggest that you do is use this webinar, the articles within, conduct a whole bunch of, another sort of segment research, really to look at some of the other structures out there, to see where some of these other companies are going, to see where peer organizations are going with this, and then to brainstorm and to think about how we can incorporate some of these concepts and what works best for us. But the principles, I think, are really, really common. More frequency, more future-looking, and then you've got to decide what to do about the rating scales and the rankism. By the way, on the Deloitte side, the rankism is something they're still struggling with doing, and it's really they haven't solved that problem, so it's not a panacea. So that's basically where I would suggest you start here. I've got time for one more question. So there's a lot of questions here. I really appreciate that. I will respond to each and every one of them by email, but I can only take one more at this particular time in the respective time. So the next question is the next and last question. It says here, I have seen the quantum tool. I'm interested in hearing about other tools organizations are using to ensure meetings are happening, tracking, and ensuring easy, simple means to capture the feedback dialogue. I would refer you to the articles that I refer here to in the webinar. Start from there, and I think that and a Google search will help you a lot. I mean, this is what we've built up. There's another one that I will put as a reference into the deck, So when you do have it, when you do download the deck in about a week, you'll be able to see. Okay, I'll do one more. Unclear if you're suggesting that we should not be engaging in the formal annual performance review. That's a decision that you need to make in your own organization as what's appropriate. What I am suggesting is that at the very least, even if you do consolidate into an annual review, that you do have the more frequent conversations so that the annual review becomes a consolidation process as opposed to the be-all and the end-all and the documented feedback or mechanism for appraisal. If you keep that, fine, but really you need to go, or I believe everybody needs to go to a more frequent process. The annual review can serve as a consolidation. So I'm sorry, there are a couple more questions here. I'm sorry I haven't had time to get to them all. I do appreciate your interest. On that note, I want to I want to, turn it back to Monica briefly for a close, and then we will adjourn.
Well, thank you very much for this insightful information, Norm. You've provided us with some great practice tips and suggestions for enhancing the feedback process. Again, if anybody has questions, do feel free to contact either of us, and do continue to join us for our monthly webinar sessions. Thank you once again.
Thank you, everybody.